Good evening, everybody. Want to thanks th- kind of thank you all for joining us this evening. Uh, Here at the Headwaters Science Institute, we're very happy to be joined by Boston Globe reporter and Pulitzer Prize winner and filmmaker David Abel, who's responsible for the film we're here to discuss, Entangled. David, thank you very much for joining us. I want to start off by commending you for making a film that examined the conflict among the stakeholders instead of inflaming it. That's not an easy thing to do under the auspices of such a socially and politically sensitive topic. So I really enjoyed seeing the issues through all the lenses that you were able to show us in the film. So again, thank you very much for being here. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and what led to your passion for taking on wildlife and climate change issues.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for having me, and I am very much looking forward to having a conversation and hearing your questions. So let's see where to start. About 2 years ago, after making several previous films about the impacts of climate change on our ecosystems, particularly our marine ecosystems, I read a report by the United Nations that I had been writing about for the Globe. And the report suggested that by the end of this century, we are on target to lose 1 million species. And that statistic was just hard to swallow, hard to understand or comprehend. And I wrote a story about it for the paper. It was on the front page, but it could only hint in words on a page at the magnitude of such an overwhelming loss of biodiversity. And I began to think, how do you go about telling that story? How can you impress upon people that we are going through this mass extinction, that we are on the verge of losing just all of this incredible biodiversity on this planet? And I thought, maybe if you told the story through one species, one particularly iconic species, a species that people seem to identify with, like great whales, maybe, if people understand the conflicts and the stakes and how we are losing in a very rapid way a species that's been with us for as long as we've been around, maybe people would have a deeper appreciation for how climate change is not some distant abstract threat, but one that is a clear and present danger and that's playing out in our lives right now. And so that's how I came to make this film. And that's really what motivated me to want to tell this story. And what we're seeing with the right whales and the conflicts and the challenges that our federal government have in terms of trying to balance these really vital commercial and really vital conservation interests are the kinds of conflicts and challenges we're going to see all across the board here in the United States and beyond. So with that said, I was just in Glasgow last week for the United Nations Climate Summit, where the international delegates are still at it. And shortly before I left, the scientists who track the state of the species of the right whale just released their latest estimate for the state of the species. And so when I first started making this film, there were an estimated 411 North Atlantic right whales, down from roughly an estimated 500 at their peak. Just a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, the scientific consortium that sort of makes the ultimate determination on what the state of the population is just estimated that their population is now about 336 right whales, which is down from their estimate last year, which I believe they estimated there were 356. So we are seeing a rapid decline in the species, and I sort of went to Glasgow with that knowledge, and it just made, in my mind, the stakes even higher.
Before we get into some of the questions we have from our groups, it almost feels like we don't have enough time, right? Like it's just 336. You said that's like, it's, yeah. How do you move forward without some sort of sense of, it's almost like a sense of panic. Like we have to do something now.
Well, I mean, on many levels, there is great urgency. There's great urgency to deal with our rising emissions, which continue to rise every single day, and then with right whales, the federal government has been talking about for the last 2.5 years an urgency to address these issues. And sorry, hey, Wolfie, can you please go to bed? Thank you. Sorry. So what we're dealing with is an urgency that. Okay. Sorry, my son is insisting.
Don't apologize.
He's like waving behind the screen. It's a little distracting. We're dealing with our own pandemic issues here. Our children's school just shut down, the first school in all of Massachusetts to shut down because there was a rash of COVID cases. So in many ways,
COVID's
it's
not
back
over?
it's back to March 2020 for us. So yeah, our kids have been cooped up for the last few days. Anyway, there is a great urgency on this issue with the right whales, and for the last 2.5 years, the federal government has been talking about this urgency, but the Trump administration really stymied any effort for a 1.5 years, and it made it very difficult to end this film. And it wasn't until actually after we made the first cut of the film that we ended up having to update the film when the federal government released their draft rules. And it wasn't until this summer that they finally issued their final rules, which is what the whole film was about, and what their efforts were to try to address this rapid decline of the species. And those rules, which were due to take effect last month, have now been put on hold because the state of Maine filed a federal lawsuit, and a federal judge essentially blocked the rules from taking effect. So despite the urgency, despite the rapid decline, we have political, legal, bureaucratic hurdles that are just making it very difficult for action to really take place on the water.
Yeah, and the film did a good job of depicting all of those issues kind of all coming together at once. Well, thanks for that terrific summary. I want to get into some of the folks we have with us tonight to ask some questions. First, I'm going to turn it over to Laura and Lauren for some perspective from some Headwaters Science Institute students. Guys? Lauren, why don't you go ahead and go first? Yep, there you go.
Hi, my name is Lauren Holm. I'm a sophomore at Los Altos High School in the Bay Area, California. I was a student during the 2021 summer Headwaters research experience, where I performed a project regarding COVID and COVID vaccines. But biology was something I was always passionate about, which is why I was really excited to be able to have this opportunity to join this discussion tonight. So I'll start with a very brief question. I know, David, that you touched on this a little bit. Sorry, so what just prior education did you have, or like experience, that you knew that you wanted to create a film like this that was so, detailed and just so interesting and so much better than I ever would have thought it could be? So what type of like education and experience did you have prior to the production of this?
Well, thank you for that question, Lauren. I appreciate that. I love the Bay Area, and so you're very lucky to live in such a special place. So I have no special scientific training. I have no, training other than as a storyteller and someone curious and fascinated about these issues. How I got into making films is a whole long story, but I started as more than 20 years ago as a newspaper reporter, and had become the environmental reporter at the Boston Globe about 10 years ago. And during that time period, the old sort of newspaper tradition has changed as the web made us a far more multimedia organization. And I was encouraged to experiment by telling stories through video. And then I took a leave of absence from the paper to do something called a Nieman Fellowship, where you get to study anything you want at Harvard University for a year. And it's kind of like nirvana for journalists. And to make a long story short, I was able to take a class with this really wonderful filmmaker, and I got to learn sort of how to use a camera and how to I learned the grammar of making films. And what happened was, for the final project for that class, I was making a short film about the first little person to run the Boston Marathon. And she was this incredibly vivacious, dynamic, 3'9" woman whose lifelong dream was to finish the Boston Marathon. And so I spent a few months filming her, and on the day of the marathon, on April 15th, 2013, I was up with her really early in the morning as she was getting ready, and I went out to the starting line with her, and then I went to the halfway point, and then somehow I made it without the proper credentials to the finish line, where I was waiting for this incredibly triumphant ending, when all of a sudden, as I was standing squarely on the center of the finish line, a bomb exploded, and then another bomb exploded.
Oh,
and as I was still really learning how to use a camera, I covered the horrific aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombings. And of course, I had a very different ending to that short film I was making for this class than I could have ever imagined. And then I spent the next year filming her, and then eventually ran the marathon with her, carrying a camera the whole way, and almost died at the end. But to make a long story short, or a long story longer, that led to my first feature film, and then I got hooked to telling stories and film, and then started making environmental films. So that's hopefully an answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That's a really cool story. Just another part about kind of like the research and production process that you went through. What did you think was like one of the most difficult things that you kind of had to push through? I know that like obviously throughout the film there were a lot of people who like had very different opinions, and a lot of people disagreed with each other. So I'm sure that made some things difficult. I was just curious what your input on that was.
Yeah, I mean, when you're making a film, there are lots of challenges. There are technical challenges, like how do you land a drone on a boat which is moving in high winds? There are challenges of getting permits to film right whales, and you're not allowed to approach right whales too closely. And then, of course, there are challenges of getting people to talk to you who might be, skeptical about what you're trying to do, and there have been death threats along the way, and getting to places where, there were developments happening that I really needed to film. And so, there are all kinds of things when you're making a film that are challenges. I think, perhaps the biggest challenge was when we were just completing the first cut of the so-called rough cut of the film. It was literally the day before the lockdown started, and we had funders who were helping us, and they pulled out, and we had to figure out how to finish the film during the lockdown. We were very lucky that we finished filming, so it was just a matter of getting the edit done. So we were lucky to be able to do that.
Yeah, well, that's really cool as well. And then another question that I was really interested in while watching the film is obviously like the new trapping systems have been kind of like an idea. Do you think that those traps could be like a possible solution to, or a solution to like a majority of the problem, and do you think they could be like produced and also like start being put into use like soon enough to correct the problem?
Yeah, so what Lauren is referring to is these ropeless fishing systems, and those ropeless fishing systems are not really that novel technology. They exist. They're based on technology that's used in a variety of places, but the big challenge remains that they are really expensive when you have to outfit several thousand boats with a system that requires new technology, and so for the moment, without federal subsidies, it's very difficult to see this taking place. But my understanding from recent conversations I've had with some of the guys who are in the film who built these ropeless fishing systems is that in many ways necessity is the mother of invention, and so the federal government, as part of the rules that came out this summer and were supposed to take effect starting this fall, but didn't because, as I mentioned, a legal ruling by a judge. But there was going to be a large closure off the coast of Maine, and apparently a good number of fishermen have been asking to experiment with this ropeless fishing gear because the federal government is going to allow fishermen to continue to fish in these closed areas if they use ropeless gear. And there is a plan on the table that will be complete, I'm told, next year, that will provide a path to ropeless fishing. And so ultimately, it seems like, that's what is, on the horizon. The federal government is going to have to come up with a plan to figure out how to, mitigate the large number of whales that are continuing to die every year. And the only real way to do that is to reduce or eliminate the amount of vertical buoy lines, or these ropes that go from the surface to the sea floor from the water column. And the way to do that, hopefully, is with ropeless fishing.
Right. Yeah. And that's a really clever idea. I would never have thought of that. And yeah, that'd be really, really good to implement into society. Thank you, David, for your time. And I want to also pass some time on to Laura to ask some questions as well. So
thank you for your questions, Lauren.
Thanks, Lauren.
Hi, I'm Laura. I was a student during the 2020 Headwaters research program, and I did a project on bluebird eggshell consumption. My first question is a bit similar to Lauren's, but it's more towards the fishermen, how accepting are they of the new systems, and like are they like easy to use and that sort of thing? And do you anticipate that if the cost was cut down, they would switch to these new systems?
So many lobstermen are creatures of tradition, which means that, it's hard to get them to change dramatically how they've been fishing for generations. That said, these are really smart people who learn how to innovate and learn how to adapt to all kinds of crazy conditions. And the technology that they've used has changed over the years, to some extent, even if the essential way that they raise their traps remains roughly the same. They use, these sophisticated GPS chart plotters that help them figure out where their traps are. And there are all kinds of new systems. I mean, a modern lobster boat and fishing boat is, a technological marvel in some ways. And so it's not out of the realm of thinking that they would be able to, figure out how to use this technology, which frankly doesn't seem all that challenging to operate. I mean, but that's easy for me as a filmmaker to say, and not, and I'm not the one who has to use the gear. And there are all kinds of complaints and other challenges that go beyond the technology, but like, making clear where, sorry about that, where all these other, where all the other traps are. And so lobstermen don't like to really, alert people to where their traps are. And the technology that would be required would have to make it, known where the traps are in some cases. So there are political issues as well. Ultimately, the answer is this: we spend billions of dollars subsidizing all kinds of things in this country. Our agricultural industries receive all kinds of federal support. And so if we care a lot about maintaining the single most valuable fishery in this country, the lobster industry, and we want to see that continue to thrive, which I think we do, because it's vital to the economy here in New England. We need to figure out, how to effectively ease the transition of all of these lobstermen, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that for a relatively small amount of money we could help subsidize the transition to that fishery.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I had one more question. In your opinion, do you think that even if very stringent regulations are to be put on lobster fisheries, or if these new technologies are widely implemented, do you think the right whales will be able to survive climate change if it's their only threat?
Yeah. Well, they're facing, multiple challenges right now, climate change being, one significant part of it. But the ultimate challenge right now is us. And we're, of course, causing the climate to change and rapidly heat up. And the waters in the Gulf of Maine, which is has been the principal feeding grounds for a long time, they are they are causing their food sources to decline rapidly, and that has caused the whales to move to places where they hadn't been seen before. So that's only exacerbating the issues. So we need to, of course, deal with climate change on a much broader level, but we also need to figure out how to stop the the casualties. And as someone in the film says, there are a lot of really difficult, challenging problems in this world. This really isn't one of them. We know what's killing these whales, and it's us, and we know how we can stop it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren and Laura. Good questions there, getting everybody thinking. We're going to transition to a couple other folks. One is Andy Giordano, chair of the Headwaters Science Institute board, along with a student of his from Tahoe Expedition Academy, Zach. Guys?
Hi, David. So as Craig said, my name's Andy, and I'm the board chair for Headwaters Science Institute. I'm also a local science teacher at Tahoe Expedition Academy. We think a lot and spend a lot of time on putting students in the field, talking to experts, and sort of preparing them for storytelling and gathering their own information. I'm going to let Zach talk a little bit about himself and get us started with his question, because he was just in Maine and has some background from that experience to work with.
Yeah, hi, I'm Zachary. I'm a senior at Tahoe Expedition Academy, and I've been really passionate about the environment and climate change kind of my whole high school career. Recently, my 12th grade class went to Maine, kind of looking at how climate is impacting the East Coast, and we actually had the privilege to speak with the Maine Department of Marine Resources right in Stonington, where I know some parts of your film really took place. And so that was a super eye-opening experience, really getting to hear their perspective, and not as much the right whale perspective until I saw the movie. And then just kind of like watching it and thinking like, wow, I can see how that tied in, and like, oh, I recognize that kind of part. So that was super fascinating. I think the first question I have for you is the kind of a broad thing. How do you think, or what lessons do you think society can learn from the situation with the right whale? You know, this is obviously not going to be the last major endangered species to go or be threatened with extinction. You know, what can we learn about the political side and how everything's working together just for future application?
Well, right whales are not, thank you, by the way, for your questions. And I'm so glad you had an opportunity to see these issues firsthand in Maine. It's an incredibly beautiful place, and there are lots of passionate people, smart people on both sides, with the stakes very high. This is not the first species to be at risk of extinction. There are sadly thousands that on the red list of endangered species by the International Conservation Union, I think it's called. And we are seeing more and more species threatened. And I think the lessons that we should draw are that it is really difficult to save an endangered species when there are commercial stakes that are at risk, and commercial interests that are at risk. And that's clearly the case here. There's a very vocal, powerful lobbying interest that has tried to, prevent action from taking place. And we've seen that with many other endangered species. And that sadly is something that is going to become much bigger part of the landscape. And I think it augurs reforms to how our federal agencies and state agencies navigate these really thorny issues.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think there's definitely a lot of lessons we can learn from this. Andy?
Yep. So we're going to kind of alternate, I think, for this round. So can you maybe reveal your view on the role that developing empathy plays in sort of tackling these environmental problems or in telling environmentally complex stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And my hope in in making a film like this, and what I've tried to do with my previous films, this is arguably the third in a trilogy of films about how climate change is affecting our marine ecosystems here off New England. The first was called Sacred Cod, which was about the collapse of our iconic cod fishery, which is fishery that essentially brought Europeans to our waters. It's what sustained the Pilgrims, and it's what brought great wealth to New England and helped finance the Revolutionary War. And in 2014, despite years of overfishing and the fishery bouncing back, the warming of the Gulf of Maine arguably led to the population of cod declining to roughly 4% of what was considered a sustainable fishery. And that led the federal government to declare a moratorium on cod fishing. And then I made a film called Lobster War, which is similarly about how climate change is affecting the other iconic industry here, lobster. And that film is about how the warming waters led to a surge in the lobster population in these waters that are both claimed by the United States and Canada and have been since the end of the Revolutionary War. But nobody really cared about those waters, or the Canadians ceded those waters to the Americans until about a decade ago, when all of a sudden there was something to fight over, and the Canadians, when they realized that there was, this explosion of lobsters in this area, said, we're going to fish, those are our waters too, and we're going to fish them. And my hope is that by telling a film, by telling a story and making films that are not one-sided, are not advocacy oriented, but try to portray the nuances, the complexities, and show empathy for the different parties involved. The hope is that that you invite people from differing points of view into the story, and maybe they can appreciate a little bit more the point of view from the other side. So, my hope is that the regulators and the environmental activists and the whale advocates who are, calling for the shutdown of the lobster industry understand, hopefully a little bit more, that there are grave consequences, economic, human, societal consequences to just shutting down this fishery that sustains so many people and pretty much the entire economy that Zach visited, over the summer. On the flip side, my hope is that lobstermen who are who are quick to dismiss the threats to the right whales understand that, we have seen just in the last decade a decline of, I think, 35 or more % of the population of right whales, which is a dramatic decline in such a short time, and that they hopefully appreciate that the leading cause of mortality and serious injuries to these great whales are their lobster lines.
That's great. I'm actually going to slide a follow-up in here and then let Zach have two. I wonder, it seems to me, whether you're talking about scientists or you're talking about in education, that learning how to tell stories is it's really challenging, and it's hard to coach and it's hard to teach. And I wonder what advice you can give to students who are watching or teachers who are watching about coaching people in telling better stories about the ideas that they have.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would just say, and maybe this is an awkward way to answer your question, but one of the challenges of telling these stories, climate change stories, science-oriented stories, is that sometimes there is a there is a chasm between the passion that you hear from the sober scientists who speak in sort of very challenging, obtuse language that isn't always immediately understandable or appreciated or resonating with people. Whereas when you hear the people whose livelihoods and traditions are affected, it's much easier to empathize with them because they speak in pretty blunt, often, sometimes vitriolic language that is easy to understand. And so trying to find a way to tell a story where there's some balance. And with this film, unlike some of my previous films, and after years of talking to and interviewing scientists, I was really fortunate to come across so many really powerful and clear and just direct explanations about the stakes and the science from the scientists who have been, screaming from, their, rarefied academic halls that this is a problem and that we need to do something about it. And they made it easier for me. There was one scientist who later explained that she, became teary. Sarah Sharp from the International Foundation for Animal Welfare, who teared up in the interview. She happened to be pregnant. And she said, if she wasn't, carrying all those hormones, maybe she wouldn't have broken up. But I later explained to her how deeply appreciative I was that she was willing to just, share her emotions, because too often scientists don't do that. And I think it was just a really powerful moment in the film after hearing so much, of the anger and the passion from the other side, that you really got an appreciation for, that, the people who are delivering the facts also, feel cared, seriously about this. But the ultimate answer to your question, and I'm sorry this is a longer answer than maybe you cared to get, is, you have to try to tell stories in ways that are humane, and touch people.
Yeah, that's great advice. It's like the objectivity we were trained with is one of our worst enemies when it comes down to it, to connecting in this way.
Yes and no. I mean, I think that, sober facts are vital to be dispassionate is vital to telling a story that, that I hope people will view as fair-minded and thought-provoking and meaningful and balanced. So, like, as I was saying earlier, I don't. If you put your thumb on the scale too much, it's easy to dismiss your film. It's easy to dismiss your journalism as one-sided. But if you take the time to portray, the different sides with a similar sort of hopeful, similar kind of empathy, then maybe, people will recognize that, there are larger issues, and the basic facts that we put through in text slides hopefully resonate and are meaningful.
Thanks so much, David.
So when I was in Maine talking with these fishermen, a lot of the things that they were bringing up was like, oh, entanglement's a factor, but they were really emphasizing the ship strike component. And maybe they were downplaying their own involvement. But I was curious if in your research you've seen like any technological advances or policy suggestions to kind of address that ship strike component with these right whales.
So that's a great question, and number one, ship strikes historically have been a significant problem, and they remain a significant issue. And in some ways, they in the last year or two or three, they have been in some cases a significant driver of mortality and serious injuries. And there have been studies that have come out that show that our regulations aren't really doing enough. So the first thing is that for many years, particularly in the 1990s, before the rope strength of lobster lines became so strong that it became very difficult for right whales or other whales to break free of these entanglements. The ship strike issue was a significant problem, and the federal government responded pretty quickly to that when it became clear that this was a problem, especially in the New England area, by creating ship speed limits, voluntary and mandatory in certain areas, shipping lanes, and guiding ships away from areas where there were aggregations of whales. And that made a significant difference. But it still remains a problem. And as a recent study showed this year, there, a lot of shipping companies and other boats are just not really abiding by the law. And we've seen all kinds of problems, especially in Canada, where there were no rules until 2017, when, as you heard in the film, we lost 12 of 17 right whales in Canadian waters because they had appeared there after the warming waters of the Gulf of Maine basically decimated their primary food source, Calanus finmarchicus, and they went elsewhere to find that food source, and they ended up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where there were no protections for them, and there were all kinds of entanglements and ship strikes. I think they primarily died from ship strikes up there because nobody, knew to look for them. That's since changed, and the Canadian government has put far more aggressive and significant rules on the water. And because their system is less bureaucratic, it's more top down. They can act far more quickly. But to give a very more concise answer to your question, the ship strike issue is a persistent problem, but it's often portrayed by lobstermen as the only problem, and they like to you'll often hear them say, but it's the cruise ships or it's the transport ships, it's not us. And it's a convenient way of dismissing their culpability in the demise of the right whale.
Yeah, no, thank you for that answer. It just seems like it could be an easier way almost to kind of eliminate maybe one or two of those deaths every few years. But I definitely kind of see that the main issue is with those lines. And then to kind of follow up a little bit, I was wondering if in any of your research, or is there like a number where it's like if the populations get down to here, it's basically going to be impossible to rebound? Or is there a number where it's going to be at a point where federal government steps in, like with the cod situation, and basically puts a moratorium like on lobstering in that area? Or how close are we to that place, or are we already past that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know that number, but I can tell you a few data points. Number one, the most important number is the amount of reproductive females in that the species has. And when you no longer have reproductive females, you don't have an ability. You have functional extinction. And the last count I heard was there were something like 70 or 75 maybe remaining reproductive females. There are younger females that will become reproductive, so that number will increase. And one good news point from this past year was that there were 18 calves born, and that's the largest number of calves born in the last 5 or so years. But we need more like 30 calves to be born every year for the population to remain sustainable. And the other data point that is a little more is more concerning is that there was a paper that came out this year that estimated that of the deaths that are recorded each year, they only account for roughly, I think, a little more than a third of all deaths. So the estimates are that we're missing roughly and are not seeing 2/3 of the deaths every year of right whales. So and one final data point is that the federal government has said that the North Atlantic right whale population can't lose more than one whale a year to unnatural causes. And in the last 20 years, I believe there's only one whale found that's died of natural causes. And I believe that whale was a calf that was found stillborn last year or this year.
Well, yeah, thank you for that answer. Definitely helps. Andy, do you have any final questions?
David, I have a ton, but we're going to move on to some of our other panel members. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Great stuff. David, I'm going to take a question from a member of our audience who happens to also be our youngest member at 8 years old.
All right.
Yeah, this is from Mari, and she wants to know how did you convince the lobsterman and his wife who were featured in the film to be a part of it?
That is a great question, and I really appreciate that question. So number one, they were very nervous to talk to me, and I'd heard about them, and basically kind of just showed up and started talking to them, and they wanted to know more about me and what my agenda was and what my intentions were, and what was I going to do with the footage and these interviews, and I totally appreciated that, because if someone came over to me and stuck a microphone in my face, I would be similarly skeptical, and anyone should be skeptical about someone who wants to put their life on a big screen. I was lucky that my previous film, Lobster War, was screening not far from where they lived. And so I invited them to come see my film and get a sense of my last film, to get a sense of how I told stories and how I sought to portray people, and they heard me speak, and I think that put them at ease. And the other way is just I think it's like Woody Allen said, half of success is showing up, or 90% of success is showing up, and that means you just you have to put in the time, and the more people hopefully get to know you and get to know your work, the more likely they are to want to work with you. And I have, I'm somewhat of an open book, because I work for a newspaper and I write stories a lot. And so it's easy to sort of, figure out who I am and what I do.
Yeah. And their contribution was invaluable to the film. I never got the impression that they were at all edited much. You gave them a great deal of opportunity to share their side of things. And I think that it was critical to kind of getting the film's message across.
And, and I am eternally grateful that they were willing to share their story with me. And they've since, become kind of like, I don't know if groupie is the right word, but like every time I have a public screening, and there hasn't been a huge amount of, in-person screenings during the pandemic, but they've appeared like without telling me. They
Great.
came to a film festival in Mystic, Connecticut, and this beautiful theater in New Hampshire, where we had a screening, and they just they're great people, and I consider them friends now.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. And thank you, Mari, for the very insightful question. We'll kind of get ourselves moving along here. We have a Headwaters community member, Shandon Lloyd, wants to chat a bit with you. Welcome, Shandon. Thanks very much.
Hi, thanks. I have an educational background in water resources, so familiar with freshwater things. But I wanted to thank you for bringing this to a wider audience. I feel like it would have been great to know about this 10 years ago before we had 35% die off. So I'm a little curious as to how long has there been activism around this issue on the East Coast? Because we didn't hear about any of it on the West Coast. So that's one question.
Yeah, it's interesting. There have been surveys. The Pew Center for I don't know exactly the full name of the organization, but they've done surveys about trying to get a sense of how familiar people are with right whales, and it's astoundingly, few. Along the East Coast, of course, people know the whales more, and in places like Georgia and northern Florida, where the breeding grounds are for the whales, people know them. And of course, here in New England, in Massachusetts, you can get license plates with right whales on them, so people do know them. But I think that until the last 5 or 6 years, the right whales were considered a success story, and their numbers, right whales, as you hear in the film, were considered by legend, they got their name because they were the right whales to kill, and they were decimated from an estimated more than 20,000 in pre-whaling days to what was considered perhaps almost extinct, and after in the 1930s and 40s, and it wasn't until the 1980s that there was significant research that started on them in New England. It was the New England Aquarium that really took it on their own to really start surveying the population, and their relatively rudimentary surveys in the 80s estimated that their population at that point was below 300. And I don't know how much stock you can actually put into those surveys, but the numbers climbed. And by 2010, their population was at I think 481 was the estimate, and or something to that effect. And they were viewed as just a success story. The ship strike issue, which was significant, and the regulations with speed limits appeared to make a significant difference and help them, and awareness, it helped them. And then, of course, the ropes changed, and more synthetic fibers were used, and they became stronger, and we started to see far more whales dying from entanglement, and other marine mammals dying from entanglements, not just North Atlantic right whales. It's other whales and turtles. Kemp's Ridley turtles often get tangled as well. In short, I think that hopefully my film and other films and other books will call more attention to right whales and the plight of the right whales, and hopefully that will make a difference.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like we have a lot of time. So right. I'm old enough to remember the dolphin safe tuna marketing campaign, and have never had tuna unless it was certified that way. So I'm wondering, has any attempts been made to bring the market to bear? So I looked on the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a great seafood watch site. They haven't been very active in doing anything around the lobster issue. And I'm just wondering, have any attempts been made to not hurt the lobster fishermen, but reward them for better practices?
Yeah, and to answer the question that just appeared on screen, number one, the Marine Stewardship Council, which certifies the sustainability of fisheries, and you can find like their blue label often on fish you buy, decertified lobster. I think it was last year because of entanglements in fishing, because of entanglements of whales in their fishing gear. Through pressure and lobbying, that has since been rescinded, and now apparently lobsters have been certified again. There have also been efforts, in part that grew out of my people who watched my film, to create groups. There's one group I think called Mainers for Right Whales, and they have put up billboards in Massachusetts, actually, because apparently you can't do this in Maine, but in the roads that lead to Maine during the months when there's a lot of people visiting Maine, basically raising concerns about the lack of the dangers that lobster lines pose to right whales. And there have been some efforts in other places to ban lobster at restaurants. And that campaign, though, has been somewhat small compared to other advocacy groups that are trying to basically press the government to act, or force the government to act through legal rulings and use of the Marine Mammal Protection Act to coerce action. And we've seen some of that actually really have an impact here in Massachusetts, where in anticipation of the rules that the film was all about, the federal efforts to try to reduce the number of lines in the water, the state of Massachusetts this year expanded the closure that you heard a lot about from Rob and Lori in the film, from just Cape Cod Bay to nearly all state waters are now closed to lobster fishing from the months of February through May, or when the whales are no longer in our waters. So that is a real significant step that has, forced lots of lobstermen to stop fishing.
So going back to subsidies for a minute with the new technology, in the main rules that are put on hold right now, is there a stick? Are there fines for fishing when they shouldn't be? I mean, is there some mechanism to sort of promote caution and other technologies being used, or going back to ropes that aren't as strong?
Yeah, so some of the requirements in the new rules require that lobstermen use something called breaking strength rope. And so one of the solutions, in addition to reducing lines or promoting ropeless fishing, is to promote the use of lines that break under 1,700 pounds of pressure. And so allegedly all lobstermen within the next year or so will have to start using this different kind of rope that breaks more easily. There are, concerns that not all whales will be able to break free, especially juvenile whales might not, be able to break free from from those lines, and there'll still be entanglements, and this rope doesn't work perfectly. And there are other efforts to like put these things called sleeves in between ropes to make them more likely to break in certain areas. So that's one of the rules. As far as penalties for violating closed areas, I don't actually know what those penalties are, but my understanding is that your lobster license could be put at risk if you're found to be violating a federal or state law. And so I think that, a lot of lobstermen would probably, there are a lot of rules that they have to follow. And I think that they would be wary of putting their very valuable lobster licenses at risk.
Okay, final question. Thank you. So, as a citizen, what's my plan of action here? What's my takeaway? What actions can citizens take to save the right whales, to prevent this from happening to other large marine mammals?
Yeah, that's a great question, and my answer is probably different today than it was maybe a year ago, when I would the simple answer would be vote, and for a year or longer, the Trump administration put these proposed rules to protect right whales in a black box and hid them somewhere at the White House until a federal court forced them to release these draft rules on the last day of last year. And so, they were released in the dead of night, I think on New Year's Eve. And then had to go through a whole long bureaucratic process. I think the only answers I can give are to, number one, arm yourself with facts, make it clear to your representatives that you want to see what needs to be done to protect not just North Atlantic right whales, but other great whales, other marine mammals, and the entire realm of biodiversity that is threatened if we do not take action that scientists say is necessary to keep our planet from warming more than 1.5 degrees. The negotiations that are happening right now in Glasgow are vital to our future, vital to a world that's sustainable for us, for whales, and for hundreds of thousands of other species. And if we don't do something soon to bend the curve to reduce our emissions, we're looking at a planet that will be very different than the one we inhabit, and one that, where a lot of species, including us, might not survive.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thanks very much, Shandon. Appreciate that. David, I'm going to take one more question from an audience, then we have just a couple more panel members for you. The scientists that were involved in the film, this is from Ambrose Toscano. What was your perspective on their ability to communicate their concerns and understandings to the public? Did you view your role as a translator between science and the public? And you touched upon that kind of earlier about scientists kind of speaking in more obtuse terms.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just to be an interpreter. It's to also parse and test and check what they say. There are lots of hypotheses that turn out to be bunk, and there are assertions that and data that don't always hold up. And so, I hope to bring to stories about scientists the same scrutiny and skepticism that I would from anyone else. Yet, I think peer-reviewed science holds a lot more value in my eyes than blanket political assertions that often are self-serving.
Right. Thanks for that, Ambrose. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. We have a couple grad students with us, Brian and Megan, who want to chat with you for a moment. Guys?
Hi, I'm Brian Williamson. I'm a PhD student at UC Davis in the graduate group in ecology and a researcher for the Center for Watershed Sciences. And I look at a lot of restoration and conservation issues in the San Francisco estuary. And I was kind of curious about some of the science you've looked into and how far northward do you think the right whales and their food source can get pushed? And is it possible that the further north they go, they might actually be pushed out of danger, or are they going to continually have the threat of ship strikes and entanglement?
Well, this is actually a fascinating question, and one I've asked a bit about to scientists who study them. Right whales traditionally have been found off of the coast of Africa. They used to range to the Canary Islands and other areas along the coast of Europe. And interestingly and mysteriously, of the 18 right whale calves that were born last year, I believe one of them, and I don't know off the top of my head if this is included in the 18 or this is or there was another one. I don't think it was actually included, but there was a video shown that was taken in the Canary Islands that appeared to show a North Atlantic right whale calf that was there. And so it is conceivable that the whales are in places that are just not being surveyed. And so, these whales can travel immense distances and can communicate over immense distances. And the phytoplankton that they survive on, the Calanus finmarchicus, can be found, well beyond where they're feeding on it. So it's conceivable that they're ranging farther than where we know where they are. I mean, traditionally, there are surveys in Cape Cod Bay and in the Bay, and there used to be in the Bay of Fundy, but they've pretty much left the Bay of Fundy, which is their summer feeding grounds, and now are mainly in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And more than half of their population ends up there, but we don't know where the other half of the population ends up. So I am really fascinated by that question.
Yeah, that's interesting. Are scientists looking into where else they might be, and maybe using some telemetry to track their movements?
I like your visitor over there.
Oh.
One of the first questions I had when I started learning about this issue and making this film is why don't we just, like, if there are fewer than 400 of these creatures, why can't we just tag them, follow them, and that would solve the problem. Then they could show up on GPS and a lot of the debates that you hear about in the film would not be relevant anymore, because you could say, oh yeah, they're swimming, just off your shores. But apparently it's really difficult to put a tag on a North Atlantic right whale. There are a variety of reasons why. Their blubber is really thick. They tend to I think, rub them off when they feed on the sea floor. They just don't apparently stay on very long, and they're also potentially dangerous and harmful to their health. I still think there has to be some other kind of solution. I mean, if we can fit a GPS tracking device in this, you'd think you could like put a suction cup of some sort or tie it around their fluke or something. It's above my pay grade, but I think that would solve a lot of problems, and then we can also find out where they're going when we can't when we don't know where they are.
Yeah. And my other question was about the Endangered Species Act and the Species at Risk Act from Canada. These are both really powerful legislation for conservation issues in both the U.S. and Canada, but it seems like they can get slowed down and stymied in courts. Do you see any way that these acts can be harnessed so that they appeal to all stakeholders involved and make things progress more quickly?
It's a fine balance. So some of the activists that you hear in the film have taken varying legal approaches to compelling the federal government to act. And one of the reasons, to go back to one of the earlier questions about why there isn't more efforts to kind of like tarnish the lobster industry or try to boycott lobster or call for whale safe lobster, is because, or to employ the in this country the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, or Marine Mammal Protection Act, in certain ways, because the concern is that if you press too far, Congress might respond in a way that would carve dramatic and potentially deleterious loopholes in these laws. And there are provisions that allow Congress in the ESA to essentially omit certain industries from various protections if they feel, if there are economic arguments that are considered sufficient and profound enough to allow a loophole. And once you start doing that, it opens up arguably a Pandora's box. So short answer to your question is, I think we have to be mindful of how we use these laws and whether there can be a rebounding, a negative consequence by being overly draconian. And I think the folks here are very conscious of that, and that's why they've taken the approach they have.
Definitely. Which
is to try to work with the industry, co-opt them in effect, as opposed to just, take a hammer.
Yeah, very delicate issues for sure. Well, thank you. I'll turn it over to Megan now.
Thanks, Brian.
Hi, David. I'm a grad student at Syracuse University studying environmental policy. And so my question, just one for you, is there's a common refrain in conservation that people get into conservation because they like working with animals or they want to work with animals, but they end up spending all of their time working with people once they get there. And so for a lot of the students that we have listening, can you talk about the interplay between climate science, marine biology, policy, bureaucracy, law, all of the things that go into this issue, and maybe some of the career options?
That's a tough question for me to answer because I am not in any of those fields. I just sort of skirt the periphery of them as a journalist and a filmmaker. I would say that the work that you guys do is really important and vital. And I have so much respect for scientists that I meet who, get dirty and, are just, trying to unearth facts and better interpret how our world is changing. And I think of the scene in the film about the veterinarians and scientists who had to do the necropsy on the right whale. And I mean, I was right there. And to this moment, as I'm reimagining that experience, I can smell, the carcass. And, these guys, you saw what they did. I mean, they were in the whale, and, covered in grime and sadly, they've had to do that a lot to try to better understand this species and what's threatening them. And I'm totally not answering your question, but I'm just trying to tell you that what you do and what you're aspiring to do and what marine biologists do is really important work. And it makes my job possible because I couldn't tell these stories without their work.
Thank you. And Craig, back to you.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Brian. David, I think we're about ready to wrap up. I want to thank you very much for spending so much time with us and being patient with everybody's questions. It's been extremely valuable to everybody, especially to our Headwaters community. Really appreciate that. I've done a lot of reading over the years on the issues out here in the West about the gray wolf, right? And they're kind of going through kind of a serious transition of their own at the moment, right? With states passing a lot of draconian laws, despite what the science says. I think conceptually, it's a similar issue to the right whale. They're not quite as in a dire situation, but I think seeing the film reminded me that instead of just getting angry about an issue and being overly passionate about it and putting blinders on, thinking there's only one solution to it, which is what I sometimes do. I get so frustrated with news that I hear about wolves that I just kind of back away from the issue altogether because I feel there's no solution to it. But I think the work you're doing and other filmmakers like you it helps me understand that there's a lot of issues to this, to be patient and to kind of listen to the whole solution, because there's a lot more to it than just stopping everything outright, right? Or just taking one draconian measure to try and end it all. So in that, I think it kind of inspired me to rethink a lot of the ways I try and be active in that issue. So thank you very much for that. And I think with that, we're ready to go. Thank you very much for spending your evening with us and staying up so late. And I hope your son got to bed.
I hope he has too. I don't know. Thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I love how you guys put this all together. It was really nice. So thank you all. And is there one more question there?
Yeah.
It just disappeared.
It looks like, yeah. Is there any interest in making a film with a battle between agricultural water use and environmental use in California?
Well, I would love to. I don't know enough about it, so but I love California, and my partner, who I've been making these films with, recently moved to San Diego. So maybe we'll find a California film to tell.
That is a big issue to tackle. That is for sure. Great.
Good.
Well,
all right. Well, thank you all, guys. Appreciate it.
Yep. Good night. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate everyone's attendance and involvement. Thank you very much. One thing I would encourage, if you haven't had a chance, or if your question or concern didn't get addressed, David's been doing a lot of these types of sessions. So if you can follow him and follow the film and the events, you might be able to get your question asked at another venue. So thanks very much, everybody. Any other questions you have, please feel free to send us an email. And thank you again for joining us.